looking at the new McLaren, the 38, you have to say, I mean, when I first looked at it, I double checked the images to make sure it wasn't last year's car, because it looks very, very similar. There are, you know, small differences. I mean, they are exactly that. They're nothing that, you know, the shape of the side pod, the shape of the side pod inlet, details around the nose and the front wing, but really, you know, nothing that you could kind of pick out and go, this really is where McLaren have made, you know, big jumps for this year. And I think they've said, you know, Andrea Stella actually came out and said, like, there's stuff we want to put on the car that's not ready yet, and it'll have to be now part of an in-season development. And when you kind of add the two up, it's like, well, what were they doing over the winter? They really got the recipe right mid-season last year. They started out again, you know, so typically with McLaren, with a car that's not great out the box, and relied on an in-season development to bring up to performance. And they certainly did that last year, and, you know, all credit to them. And they ended up with, again, this kind of, I won't call it a Red Bull or an Aston Martin clone, but they got all those right bits working in the right way together, and I'd end up with a car that was one of the best out there, next, you know, obviously next to the Red Bull. You can't go into a season wanting to, you know, be successful, wanting to have a potential for a championship, and then say, look, we're just not ready for the first, you know, flyaway races. I mean, you know, even if you look at the calendar now, the first flyaway races are, you know, almost a quarter of the season now before we reach what we would regard as the European season. So I'm a bit confused. Obviously, they've done lots of work under the skin, and it's the stuff that we simply, you know, can't assess what they've made changes to. The car was always very difficult to drive last year, and as you know, it was a pattern that had been following on the McLarens for a while. You know, they've obviously worked on areas like that to make the car more drivable, make it easy for the drivers to control it, to get it to do what they want. So maybe it is less about visible external aerodynamics and much more about the finessing of the suspension and of, you know, the detail of the underfloor or the rest of the bodywork. The Aston is very much like we've seen with the Mercedes. It's one of the cars that is, you know, maybe a bit more than an evolution of what we've seen before, but it's following, you know, lots of very similar principles. So we know that the new Aston Martin will run the same rear suspension and gearbox carrier as the Mercedes factory team, and as we expect Williams will as well. So it has push rod rear suspension. It's got a lot of anti-squat built into the geometry at the rear of the car to match the anti-dive that you have at the front of the car. So you're using the suspension to try and keep the car flatter under acceleration and braking. But McLaren developed their own gearbox case. They run the Mercedes gearbox, which is the cartridge that sits inside, but the carbon fiber outer, or all suspension attaches to it, is McLaren's own design. They've always decided to remain independent in that respect. So they're keeping hold of their setup. And again, they put, you know, a lot of anti-squat into the rear suspension, as far as I can see as well. Everyone's playing with either for, you know, controlling the aero platform, or actually with, particularly with the front, you're actually creating downwash with those suspension elements, which is equally a big feature of the Aston Martin. So Aston Martin have gone for what we call these underbite inlets, or post box inlets, where you have the inlet is very high, and, you know, the actual scoop underneath is almost blanking off, so the airflow has to start to come downwards to go into the side pods, into the radiators. And Aston Martin have followed Red Bull very much in that direction. They were going that way last year. They've gone even more extreme for the new car. And to help the downwash, they're actually using that top wishbone of the front suspension. They've raised it up as high as it will go, and actually raised it very high, very horizontal, with little dips at the end just to go into the wheel. And they're using that to actually curl the airflow down that's coming up off the front wing to go into those side pod inlets. The mirrors and the stalks around those as well are equally used to try and create a bit of downwash. And again, you're seeing a very positive direction in there. You're changing everything to be just a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more progressive than they've done previously. I'd love to know the exact names that were behind some of the big decisions, but yes, I think this is probably the first one that is fully in the control under Dan Fellows and, you know, all of the new people that have come in. And I think development through last year may have, you know, suffered while they were kind of changing everyone around and reorganizing. And I think certainly for Aston, the biggest problem was in-season development last year that really fell short when they found that their car was just too draggy. Reg changes, particularly around the front wing flexibility, really hurt them. And they had plenty of aero testing time, but they didn't seem to kind of recover their year last year. So you would have to say that there's a question mark on their ability to correlate their development to on-track performance. And I guess that could be one of the big question marks over this new car. They've made changes. Are these changes going to work for the better? Because changes made during the season last year didn't really bring Aston back into competitiveness at any point during the year. When you're talking about suspension aerodynamics, there's, you've got a trade-off between what you're doing. Anti-dive isn't the fix-all. It only really affects you when you're accelerating or braking. So, actual heave from downforce or bumps or what have you on straights won't be affected by anti-dive. So you'll still have a degree of aero sensitivity if your floor is very sensitive. And I think this is what teams have been playing with over these past few years, is matching the floor sensitivity to the suspension. So if you have a very stiff suspension, you can also have a very sensitive aero, because you're always going to be keeping that floor in exactly the position it wants by kind of force, really, by stiffer springs and everything. And that can bring performance, but it also brings downsides. No one wants a super stiff car, but it could give you more performance overall. But you could then go to a less sensitive underfloor that allows you to have a bit more pitch under braking and acceleration, a bit more roll, and a bit more movement on the straights. And that means you can have softer suspension, which gives you benefits in slower corners, but maybe that doesn't give you that peak downforce. So I think everyone's just playing with this, and anti-dive is just one of the factors that people will bring into this. There's other ways that you can deal with this. Like Red Bull are very good at having a kind of a dual rate suspension. So there's two springs on everything. There's two springs in the anti-roll bar. There's two springs in the heave spring. There's two springs if they're running side springs. So there's always different ways you can play with it. And I don't think you can ever kind of say, well, you just run anti-dive because it just works, because it may be working against you. And there's other sort of little factors in there that coming into the detail of the engineering. But again, I think everyone will find their own way of doing these things.
Speaking of Red Bull, those angled front wishbones that were characteristic of the RB19, we've seen a couple of teams adopt those. Is that becoming more and more commonplace? What do the other teams think about that? And is that part of the whole anti-dive system?
It's part of the anti-dive system. Pretty much everybody's going that direction one way or the other, and they had last year. I mean, Mercedes actually changed mid-season. And it is, yes, part of the anti-dive, but it's also part of the aerodynamic setup. And this goes back to whether you have push or pull rod on the front. It's like you're trying to direct the airflow downwards. And with that really angled top wishbone and lower wishbone, it's really kind of pushing the air down into the underfloor tunnels. So it's helping you, in an aerodynamic way and in a suspension way, which again equally helps your aerodynamics. So it's a kind of a double win if you can, get the setup working, for the compliance that you want and the geometry you want in terms of keeping your cambers and your casters where you need them through suspension movement.
And best used with a push rod layout?
I don't think it makes a difference. We've seen both. It depends where you want your airflow. I mean, I think really the difference between push rod and pull rod is just where that rod meets the chassis. Is, do you want that surface there to be creating downwash at the top for push rod or down at the bottom for pull rod? And again, everyone will have their own opinion on what to do. I think given another year of development, I think we may find that teams all end up with push at the back and pull at the front. But I don't think it's one of those things that's super important in terms of, overall performance of the cars. It's one of those kind of tertiary things. It's like, we've got the floor and suspension working. We've got the side pods working with the floor. Now we can play about the suspension. It's kind of in that order of importance.
Finally, Scarbs, I know we're jumping around a little bit, but just going back to McLaren, do we know yet if McLaren's wind tunnel is now fully commissioned and this car is a product of the new tunnel? And how's the tunnel going?
Oh, well, I've heard nothing to say otherwise. So I believe the tunnel was in production midway through last year. not necessarily working on last year's car, but last year's car would have been in there in order to correlate its results from that tunnel to the Toyota tunnel and obviously to on-track performance. So I would guess the majority of the performance of this car, the development of this car, comes from their own tunnel now rather than Toyota's.
Be interesting to know. It'd probably be the first McLaren in a long time not to have gone into a Toyota wind tunnel.
Exactly. Yes.
Going back to the early 2000s, probably.
I'm trying to remember when they switched over, but it was quite a while ago. And yeah. Toyota have lost a couple of good customers now, because obviously you've got McLaren and Andretti were in that tunnel. Both won't be using it. So if anyone is planning on starting a Formula One team or any other motorsport, there's time available, probably at a discount, at your local Cologne wind tunnel.
But don't start employing anyone until you've got your letter of approval from the FIA, and presumably you've spent your 2 billion in getting the entry, or whatever it's going to be, 3 billion maybe to get an entry these days. Who knows?
Exactly.
Scarbs, wonderful to talk to you as ever. We'll catch up with you again very, very soon when we see the new Red Bull RB20.